If the state decides it needs to create its own currency, you need a state bank to do it. Hey, yeah, we keep hearing over and over again, the dollar is going to crash. It's going to be absolutely worthless someday. It would be nice if we had our own state bank. In the event that there's a crisis, we could create our own currency.
Good evening and welcome to the July 2016 Oakland County Campaign for Liberty Action Briefing at Shields Pizza in Troy, Michigan. All the way from Wayne County, Michigan. He's coming up here. You know him. Star of stage and screen. Star of fighting the financial interests of the politicians and fighting for our interests. Ladies and gentlemen, the great Dan Osterman. Daniel?
Wow. That's going to be tough to follow. I'm going to try and keep the enthusiasm going here. My gosh. Anyway, so I'm here to talk about a state bank. It's been about a 3-year quest of mine. I have been working with legislators. I've been going to Lansing. I've done my speed dating, as I called it, in Lansing, where I've gone office to office and doing my own personal lobbying on this issue. It's finally coming to a head. We're finally making some very serious progress. There are bills. There's more than one. There's some reasons for that. But anyway, the bills have now been written. They have not yet been dropped. Can I take this off here? Sure. Go ahead. Okay. I like to walk around a little bit instead of standing in front of a microphone. So the bills have been written. They have not technically been, quote, dropped, which means they basically get dropped into, what do I want to say, the schedule. There are 2 courageous representatives in this state who came forward and said, okay, we're gonna write the bill, we're gonna co-sponsor it. Some of you might know Martin Howerlich. He's from this area. How many of you in Martin's district? Any of you? Okay. And the other guy, I'm sure there are. There's George. Okay. The other representative, I'm sure none of you are in his district, but he's next to my district, and he's in my congressional district, and that's Pat Somerville. So these guys have stepped forward. We have support across the aisle. Christy Pagan, who is a Democrat from Canton, is solidly behind this idea. I also went to Lansing and did a presentation with a group of representatives, and one of which was, to my surprise, chair of the banking committee, and he wants this bill going through, or these bills going through his committee. So it's very encouraging. I was hoping we would get this moving a little bit further before recess, but that hasn't happened yet. Let me just say this. There's going to be some opposition to this idea. And where you're going to get the opposition, where we're seeing opposition, is obviously people in the banking industry, the big boys, okay? This is kind of cutting off their, I want to say their gravy train a little bit. Don't believe anything they tell you. They're going to tell you there's all kinds of, bad things can happen if we do this. It's not true. There's no downside to this. If you guys ever get the chance, I don't know how many of you already have, but do some research on the Bank of North Dakota. North Dakota is a solidly red state, has a Republican governor. The Republican governor is the former head of the Bank of North Dakota. That bank has been around for almost 100 years. It's been incredibly successful. It's had 12 consecutive years of record profits that they give back to the taxpayers. Anyway, let's move on. So what are some of the advantages? Well, it helps to create new jobs and spur economic growth, and it does, as I said, it generates revenue for the state, and it's a legitimate source of revenue, which is basically from loans. It can be loans to small businesses, startups, medium-sized businesses too. It lowers the debt cost for local governments. And when I say that, what I mean by that is the state essentially can loan to municipalities. And they're going to use
essentially credit that's created from our money that's sitting in bank accounts today. And you're going to see what I'm talking about in a few minutes. It strengthens local banks because what it does is it partners. It does not compete with local banks, just the opposite. It actually helps the local banking community. It provides liquidity, and what it also does is that it can partner with local community banks on loans that otherwise they may not be able to provide. And as I said, it can help build up small businesses. And a concrete example is almost 100 years of consistently successful. It got cut off at the bottom of the Bank of North Dakota. And by the way, during the 2008 banking crisis, not a single community bank in the state of North Dakota went under. Not one. It helps to create new jobs. Well, how does it do that? It allows local community banks to back promising startups, like I said, and because of specific accountability measures, the state makes sure public money is creating jobs. How many of you love the MEDC? Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, in the state of North Dakota, if there's what they call economic development loan. Now, they're kind of careful about economic development loans. I was listening to a conference call with a former board member of the State Bank of North Dakota. He said that he never met a politician who saw an economic loan he didn't like. But anyway, they're very careful about that, and there are accountability measures in every one of those loans that they give out in terms of economic development. In other words, after a year, it is audited by the bank, and if it's not performing, then it has to pay any interest reduction that it got from the state bank. It has to basically pay up. Okay? It generates new revenues for the state, like I said, through bank dividends. You can see here, if the state of Michigan, now if you extrapolate the size of the economy and the size of the state of the Bank of North or the state of North Dakota, and in relation to the state of Michigan, based on what they have earned in 2015 in dividends, we could have earned hang on here, let's move it back here. We could have earned $1.3 billion just from the state bank.
In 1 year?
I think that's kind of about what they said we had to have in new taxes for the roads.
Yep.
Okay. So what it does, it keeps interest money in Michigan, and it doesn't go to Wall Street. Everyone understands how bonds work. You know, when a community issues a bond, they got to, typically go to Wall Street. Wall Street sells the bond. They pay a fee for that, and they end up paying interest on that bond, whoever the investors are. They could be people that are outside the country. So basically, we're sending our tax dollars in interest to foreign governments, to foreign individuals, and it's not staying here in the state. It lowers public debt costs, and here's an example that I use. Livonia, they passed a bond millage, a bond, and for schools. They wanted to redo the schools, build a new high school. It was $195 million that they wanted to borrow, and they had to go get a bond. The interest rate on that is 4.75 and 5%. The total interest they're going to pay over that bond is almost $176 million in interest on that bond. They're almost going to double the entire cost. If we had a state bank and we lent that money through the state bank to Livonia, even at 1%, the total interest would be only $35 million. And they'd have a total savings of $140 million to the taxpayers in Livonia. We could even loan it at 0% and only have them paying the service fees. That's it. And in North Dakota, they do a lot of that. Public works projects, they don't charge interest on it. It's basically just loan servicing. It strengthens the local banks by evening out the credit cycles. I won't get too deep into what that means, but the Bank of Michigan support for local bank has a crowding in effect. So basically what that means is when you talk about a crowding in effect, if you're saving money, or even if you're paying interest, let's just say the Bank of Michigan
makes $1.3 billion, in interest in small loans, right? That $1.3 billion is staying here in Michigan. It's being spent in Michigan. And what it does is it circulates through our own state economy. What we do with our money today is it sits in banks, right? And we get a little tiny piece of interest off of it. But the banks get to use that money to create more credit and create more interest that goes to the banks. And it doesn't stay here in the state. It goes to Wall Street typically. So the Bank of Michigan can also help the state's community banks navigate the new regulatory waters. Well, ever since they added all this Dodd-Frank and everything else, the regulations have become extremely burdensome to a lot of the community banks. It's a very huge cost. They've even had to, in some cases, they have to add employees just to get through that. In the state of North Dakota, the state bank navigates through that for them at the community level. They don't have to worry about that. So, and it evens out, even acts as a new incubator for strong local financial institutions, like I said, the local community banks. So, the state-owned bank, what does it kind of look like? I get that question all the time. Well, let me just clarify this. It is not run by politicians, it's run by bankers. And that's what we insist on in the legislation. This has to be independent and it's run by bankers. These aren't politicians that get selected to the board. And they're, by the way, the employees of the bank are employees of the bank. So, as I said, not politicians, and the Bank of Michigan would not risk state funds or tax money. It's self-funding and self-sustaining. I don't know how many people, do you understand how credit is created, most people? Do you understand how the bank creates credit? Well, first of all, even the Federal Reserve, they've even published it. Banks do not lend deposits. Deposits only act as a reserve. And based on that amount of that reserve, they can create 10 times that amount in credit. It's just digits, okay? It's the same thing we can do. We can deposit our tax dollars in our own bank. Instead of it sitting in some, Chase Bank or Bank of America earning 1% interest, we could have it deposited in our own bank and be creating credit to lend out to small businesses and earn interest off of that, just like the bank does. The big banks, I should say. And the government of North Dakota has been able to lower tax rates 4 times in the last 10 years because of the bank. They've returned so much. Here's some common misperceptions. During the public banking is riskier, but during the 2008 financial crisis, you can see they had the lowest unemployment in North Dakota, biggest state budget surplus, the most community banks, and the lowest number of bank failures in the United States, which was 0. The Bankers Association supports wholeheartedly the state bank. So far, we have, at least the legislators have talked to the community bankers here in Michigan, and it's kind of we don't necessarily support it, but we're not necessarily against it. So they really haven't fully taken a position on it yet. And I don't necessarily expect them to until they see the legislation, to see what it's actually going to look like. I also point out here, that if it was riskier, there would be never be a liquidity crisis on Main Street, which there was during 2008. That's really what was the cause of the crash. It's just credit just stopped. Return on taxpayers' money invested with the bank would not be significantly better than the return on investment which the state currently is receiving with private banks. That's laughable. Okay. Once again, I talk about the multiplier effect, but in 2015 annual report, they reported the 12th consecutive year with $130.7 million in net earnings. Now that's a state that's about the 10th the size in population as Michigan. The total assets at the Bank of North Dakota increased from $7.2 billion to $7.4 in 2015. and ended the year with capital 749 million. Just some statistics, just to show you it's positive. It's always been positive. State's return on its investment at the bank was a healthy 18.1%. Okay. Yeah. So when we talk about building a state bank, one of the questions I always got from legislators when I corner them and say, hey, what about this idea? First thing, because they really don't understand what it means to have a state bank or the type of state bank that we're proposing. Initially they would say, yeah, but we'd have to go out and get a bond to have to seed the bank and put us further into debt. Not true. I'm going to show you why. But there's also several states that have bank initiatives taking place right now. Here are the states so far. There's 20-some that have legislation, they're writing legislation, have passed legislation through the House and waiting to get it through the Senate. So this isn't something that we're doing all by ourselves and nobody else is even considering this. No, this is being done all over the country. What I would love to see is that we're the second ones to do it. So the biggest banks in the U.S. are making far fewer loans to businesses. We know that. You can read about it. A lot of the money that they've been pumping into the economy, we know that they're printing money. If you'll notice, a lot of it is going to the big banks, and they're using it to buy stocks back. In fact, the Federal Reserve just came out, I think, last week and said, go ahead, start buying your stock back, and told the banks, go ahead and start buying your stock back. And that was with their excess reserves. They basically made them pump up their reserves to a higher level. Now they're saying, well, you can bring that down now. Oh, and by the way, with that money, buy your stock back. What does that tell you? To me, it sends a red flag. Something's going on. Through 2015, the large banks originated only 43% of business loans up to $1 million, and that was down from 58% for all of 2009. So just here's some more evidence. You look at some of these figures here, rates on credit. Here at some banks, a credit card has become the default loan source for small businesses because of the liquidity crisis. And the rates on the cards issued to small businesses are averaging 12.85% interest that these businesses are paying. With a state bank, we could provide these small businesses with 3%, 4% business loans. Small business spending on credit and charge cards will total an estimated $445 billion this year, which is up from $230 billion in 2006. So that shows you that small businesses, they're not getting the credit. There's no liquidity for these guys. So here's just some facts everybody knows. Wall Street cheated us through LIBOR, keeping public money at home where it works for the people, not the banks. Some economists believe just having a state bank can turn your economy around in 1 year. It's impossible to have state sovereignty without control of the state's monetary system. So if we have a state bank, not saying that we would ever do that, although Texas talks about it, but if we ever did decide that we were going to secede, hey, if we got our own state bank, guess what? We can do it. Without it, we can't. If the state decides it needs to create its own currency, you need a state bank to do it. Hey, we keep hearing over and over again, the dollar is going to crash. It's going to be absolutely worthless someday. It would be nice if we had our own state bank. In the event that there's a crisis, we could create our own currency. So, I'm going to leave you some key points. I brought this down. Now, there's some other things that I can show you here, but some of the key points are, it's a win-win. Bank of North Dakota is a proven example. We're not going to reinvent the wheel. This isn't something that's never been tried before, and we're going to, head out there and prove to the world that it can be done. It's already been done, okay? Several states are working to establish them. Wall Street's corrupt. We know that. I mean, I remember listening to, I think his name was Jeffrey Sachs. He's the economics professor at Columbia, once said in a seminar, he's been working on Wall Street and covering Wall Street for 30-some years, and he said, and I can tell you right now, there's not one moral fiber left on Wall Street. Not one.
He's from Oak Park, by the way.
Is he really? Yeah. Time's running out, okay? That's why I've been on this so hard, because if and when we get to that time where we have another financial crisis, if we don't have our own state bank in place, we are going to wish to heck we did. We got to get this done. And by the way, in 2008, if people don't know, the state lost $18 billion on Wall Street from our investments. Question is, if the next one's worse than 2008, what are we going to lose the next time? And by the way, we haven't even recovered what we lost in 2008. We've had, the taxpayers of the state of Michigan have had to put anywhere from $300 to $400 million a year into the pension funds to make up for all the losses that we had. And we're still not where we were when it crashed. So get educated. There's a website called the Public Banking Institute. There's a lot of good articles on there. Now let me just explain to you about the Public Banking Institute. It's made up of liberty-minded people. It's made up of progressives. It's made up of Greens. It's made up of every political stripe you can think of. I'm the state coordinator for Michigan with the Public Banking Institute, and I get on these conference calls, and I can tell you, it's interesting. I mean, eventually, nobody says where they are politically, where they are on the political spectrum, but you can kind of find out where everybody is. What I find amazing is everybody's in agreement about how this can benefit every state. If we did this, it would make the Fed almost obsolete. We wouldn't have to worry about anything with it. We could start the ball rolling here in Michigan to make them obsolete, right? Make them non-relevant is the way I look at it. I have a Facebook page called Innovative Solutions for Prosperity, and I publish videos, I publish articles about State Bank and some other things too. There's another subject that I talk about. Read about the CAFR swindle. I don't know, does everybody understand or know what the CAFR is? C-A-F-R. If you don't know, it's the Consolidated Annual Financial Report in the state of Michigan. Every year has to publish one. And basically what it does is it tells you what's left, what's the balance sitting in 83 separate funds that the state has. And right, I was speechless too when I heard that. Okay, and when I investigated it. I've read the CAFR, went through it in 2012. It's 283 pages. It took me 3 times to go through it to kind of pick off the relevant information there. The biggest scam in the history of mankind, Hidden Secrets of Money, and the Public Banking Institute. So tell everyone you know that you run into, they need to learn about a state bank, the Bank of North Dakota. Give them some of this information, these resources that they can read about. But more importantly, put pressure on your representatives in the state to get this legislation moving. Get them to co-sponsor it. I know Jim Runstead said that he would get on board, so you might want to talk to him again and stay on them. Make sure that they don't at the last minute buckle at the knees and decide that they're not going to do this. So, but real quick, I'll just let you know, I wasn't going to include this, but I just want to show you real quick. These are the 83 funds that have balances at the end of the year in 2012. And there's almost $72 billion back then that was laying around in all these funds. The lion's share of it was the pension funds. But still, if you take that out, there's plenty of money that we could deposit into a state bank and create a tremendous amount of credit to benefit the state and get rid of the MEDC.
Exactly.
That's it. If you got any questions, just a couple. You want to just take a couple
We'll take one.
questions?
Let's take one. We'll take one.
Take one
The
question.
initial funding is transferring other funds, it's not from somewhere else. In other words,
No.
the initial capitalization of the bank is from funds that the state already has.
From these funds.
So no new tax.
No new taxes, no new debt, nothing. And right now, by the way, the state is paying $2.2 billion in interest on bonds. If we had our own bank, we could restructure those through our state bank and save the taxpayers $2.2 billion just at the state level.
Thank you. You know, Dan talked about making the Fed irrelevant, so how about a quick chant just for old time's sake? And the Fed! 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 You guys are outstanding, and people all over the world are watching this now, one or two of them anyway. So, actually, I think we're up in double digits, so that's great. And George, thanks again for doing this, and everybody. And okay, so this is fantastic. And Dan, you always do great work. I really admire how you do this. And you're welcome, sir. Thank you for joining us and enlightening everybody.